From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and ahead today, K-State's John Jaeger reporting on his new study of post-shipping exercise of long-hauled beef calves as a possible way of reducing respiratory disease in those calves shortly after arrival. John says this tactic could well pay off for you cattle feeders. Also, highlights from the latest Cattle Chat podcast out of the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State, the emphasis this time on pre-breeding bull management. Joining the regular K-State panel for that discussion, Kansas Animal Health Commissioner Dustin Smith. And on this week's horticulture segment further ahead, K-State's Judy O'Mara talks about 3 common landscape pine diseases and how to distinguish between them, which is highly important. All that here on Agriculture Today.
Burning prairie grass is essential for Flint Hills ranchers. Following grazing and burning best practices can ensure that the prairie remains intact while not smoking out downwind neighbors. The Kansas Flint Hills Smoke Management Plan helps guide prescribed burning on prairie land. To learn more, visit www.ksfire.org. Again, that's www.ksfire.org.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. Glad to have you aboard once again. Well, today was to be the day that the K-State Agricultural Research Center at Hays was to hold its annual Beef Research Roundup. Well, because of COVID-19 and the associated complications, that event was canceled. But what we've done today is invited one of the intended presenters at that field day. John Jaeger is with us via phone. John is a beef cattle scientist at the Agricultural Research Center at Hays. John, good to have you aboard, and what we're going to cover here today is a project that you were directly involved in, looking at long-hauled, high-stressed beef steers as they would be received into a backgrounding program, and the effect of exercise on their health, on their performance. Talk about the issue at hand where long-hauled cattle can be predisposed to some issues, right?
That is correct. That's why we chose this class of cattle. And the major thing that our feedlots in the Great Plains face with those cattle out of the southeast is bovine respiratory disease. It continues to be a significant challenge. It not only causes illness and death, but cattle that have had BRD or bovine respiratory disease have reduced performance, which includes slower gains, and so then they have poorer performance, requiring more pounds of feed per gain. And then those cattle also have, at the time of harvest, have decreased quality grade, so that decreases profitability, and associate that with increased drug treatment costs and low carcass values. It just becomes a very costly disease.
So then, as the purpose of this research goes, you were trying to determine whether that stress and therefore that BRD potential could be affected by exercising calves. Explain the thinking behind that proposition, John.
Well, typically when we receive these cattle, and for example for this project, we had an order buyer obtain these cattle in sale barns in Mississippi and Alabama, and put together truckloads so that they go from the sale barn to a holding facility. They are fed, some hay to get them by until they get a truckload put together, and then they're on that truck for 17 hours to get to Hays, Kansas. So what we've observed is, of course, those cattle are really tired when they get off the truck. They want to just lay down. And they will get up and get a drink of water, but it's hard to get them to start eating. And we've observed when we go into those pens to check for illness and those cattle get up, they tend to kind of trickle towards the feed bunk and start taking a few bites of feed. And whether we are weaning local cattle or buying local sale barn cattle that have just been weaned, the key to keeping them from getting sick or reducing the incidence of BRD is to get them eating. The more energy you can get into those cattle, the less likely it is they become sick.
So where then does the exercise component come in here?
So our thought was if we entered the pens every 6 hours and walk those cattle within our pen, just get them up and just not aggressively move them, but just encourage them to walk from one end to the other of the pen. Number one, it would get them up and get them moving, which would get their blood pumping and get their respiration rate up a little bit and help them clear their lungs a little bit of anything that might be starting to accumulate. And also it would help them discover where the water was and get them to come into contact with the feed bunks and maybe take a few bites while they're making this circuit within their pen. So we did that every 6 hours for the first 14 days.
And then you compared that group of calves to calves that were not put through this exercise regimen at all, right?
That is correct. The other group we handled just as local sale barn cattle that wouldn't have this high stress, made sure they had water, and then checked them twice daily for any signs of illness. Just a typical management scenario versus an exercise scenario.
And then you made this comparison on several levels here as to how that exercised group of cattle performed and reacted to that practice as compared to those which weren't exercised. Let's start with the actual impact on average daily gain here. What did you find, John?
Really, for most things, including average daily gain, there were no statistically significant differences. And an average daily gain especially was not different between the two treatment groups. That being said, with a lot of the other things we looked at, even though they were not statistically significantly different, there were numerical differences. And if you look at those on a biological basis, I think it gives us some really meaningful answers that could be really important to success of handling these high-stress calves and the economic outcome.
In terms of, for one thing, the prospect of BRD turning up?
Exactly. If we looked at just treatment rate by day 14 when we had completed the 4-time daily exercise, there were 7.7% more control steers had to have been treated for BRD compared to the number that were treated in the exercise group.
So that can be significant when you start looking at the cost of treatment and everything that goes into that necessary response.
Exactly. That is where I think this is biologically significant, even though the numbers were not statistically different. So almost 8% higher pull rate and treatment cost is going to be really meaningful in your bottom line. And then if we go ahead and look at death loss, there were 2.7% more steers died in the control group by day 14 compared to the exercise group, and by day 28 that had decreased a little bit, but there were still 2.1% more steers had died in the control group due to BRD compared to the exercise group. So if you just look at the cost we paid per head and look at that difference, that accounts to $4,700 difference between the two treatments.
So now you're talking a fairly decent amount of money involved here.
Yes, and I should mention this was 275 heads that were split into the two treatments. So when you get to a commercial yard that is larger pen sizes and larger groups, that number would increase as well. So economically, I think we're really onto something. However, it's not, in most cases, feasible to exercise cattle 20 minutes every 6 hours.
So perhaps that schedule could be scaled back some?
I really believe so. I think that just getting them up, and typically your pen riders are going to ride through your cattle and look for the six and pull those and treat them. Mm-hmm. But they don't really push the cattle a lot. And so if they're checking even twice a day and they actually move those cattle back and forth a little more within their pen than what is maybe typically done, I think that there may be some cost savings there. The other thing we did notice is by exercising them and being with them longer, we identified those animals that needed retreated earlier and got a better response to the second treatment. And so that also probably helped decrease the death loss among the exercise cattle compared to the control cattle.
John, as an addendum here, if you will, you also looked at the feed efficiency performance of these respective pens of cattle. What did those numbers tell you?
That was really surprising because although there was not a difference in average daily gain, those exercise steers were more efficient, requiring only 3 pounds of feed per pound of gain during the first 14 days, compared to the control steers, which required 3.4 pounds of feed per pound of gain. So for some reason, exercising those cattle made them more efficient, and so that also plays into this whole economically beneficial side of some sort of exercise for these newly received cattle.
Well, this is well worth a look, given the costliness and the associated problems with long-hauled cattle becoming sick shortly after arrival. This idea of exercising those long-hauled, high-stressed steers in this case during the receiving period. And John, this information is printed up as part of the Roundup report if somebody would like to have a look at it.
That is correct. There are hard copies here in Hayes that we would be happy to hand out to anyone who is interested, as well as a PDF digital copy that's available on the K-State website.
Good work and an interesting angle on managing those long-hauled calves. John, as always, a pleasure. Many thanks for being along with us right here.
It's been a joy.
He's beef cattle scientist John Jaeger, who is based at K-State's Agricultural Research Center at Hayes. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Keeping your distance from others is important in slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are some fun things to do alone. Read a book, take a walk, unpack your suitcase from that trip you took last September, paint a self-portrait, catch up on a TV series, do a puzzle. Remember, we should all stay home to lower the risk for everyone. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Agriculture Today continues now, and we're around to time for more insight from the team of expertise at the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State. This from the latest BCI Cattle Chat podcast. And part of the focus there was on bringing new bulls into the cow-calf herd in advance of spring breeding and managing the nutrition of bulls ahead of that breeding go time. Aboard for this conversation, K-State veterinarians Brad White and Bob Larson, cow-calf specialist Bob Weaber, livestock economist Dustin Pendell, and a guest panelist, the Animal Health Commissioner with the Kansas Department of Agriculture, Justin Smith. Brad kicks things off.
We're going to talk some about incoming bull management. So a lot of folks are still buying bulls. You're bringing bulls to the ranch, thinking about the breeding season. What do I want to do before I bring that bull on my ranch and expose him to the cows? And then we had a great listener question relative to, once I get that bull on my ranch, what type of transition diet should I put him on? This is the time of year, and we talked a couple episodes ago about buying a bull and how you select a bull. We got a lot of listener response on that question. Now we're going to move to the second phase of that, and it's great that Justin is here with us because he's got a lot of experience in this area. He mentioned he worked on a ranch. He's been the state animal health commissioner, so he's dealt a lot with this part of the process through commerce. But before I bring a bull onto my ranch, what are some of the things you guys want to consider? And I'll phrase this in a way of what tests or what should I have done to him, assuming I picked the right bull. Now, how do I make sure he's safe to bring home? Any thoughts in that area?
Well, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but as a veterinarian, I definitely want a breeding soundness exam on that bull. And even if I bought this bull at a sale, if he was examined several months ago, I probably want to repeat that breeding soundness exam right before the start of the breeding season so that I'm turning out a bull that is fertile and ready to go. So that's one aspect.
Absolutely. You got to have that breeding soundness exam. He's ready to breed. Justin, anything else you'd look for in some of the diseases that we want to test for?
I think probably the biggest thing out there right now that we make sure that we don't want to forget about is trichomoniasis, still a venereal disease that affects our herd population as far as infertility and early term abortion. So we want to make sure that these bulls are not carrying trichomoniasis. And so I would encourage them that if bulls are not considered virgin or are not considered below the test eligible age, that they have those bulls tested before they brought on. Fortunately, here in Kansas, we don't have a huge issue with trichomoniasis, but we still have it out there. And
it's not zero yet, is it,
That's
Justin?
exactly right. And the other thing is there's states out there suffering from it far greater than we are. So if you're buying bulls from out of state, make sure you know what the entrance requirements are from that and what that herd is.
Now, do I have to test every bull for that? And is that something I need to test for every year or just new bulls?
No, I would test your bulls every year. And in fact, we have some operations that are testing twice a year. They're testing them when they're sending them in and when they're coming out. Gives them a little better idea what may be happening out there, because it is. Trichomoniasis is kind of that silent disease. We don't see it until the impact of open cows or early term abortions. And so it is a test. It's relatively simple to do when you're handling your bulls. And so, but yeah, I would encourage people to at least test once a year, most definitely. And if they can, and work it in twice a year, particularly if you're using a fall and a spring calving herd, if you're moving them from different herds.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something good to keep in mind. And you mentioned, look at your state regulations in your state. So a lot of times it's required that you'd want to test at, say, a non-virgin bull or a bull that's 18 months or older or 24 months or older. The age changes a little bit by state. So look at your state regulations. But that's from a regulatory standpoint, but even from a herd standpoint, you want to be able to protect them from coming in. And even if they come in and we've done the BSE and we've done some testing, I want to be sure that they maintain that health. So they need to be well vaccinated, treated for internal, external parasites. What about keeping them separate? Should I just put them into the herd?
That's a great point. And that isolation's one, I think oftentimes it's not super convenient for producers sometimes to get a new bull and bring him in and put him in kind of a isolation or quarantine, but is really a good idea, both from a biosecurity standpoint, but also an animal nutrition standpoint. So sometimes these yearling bulls come in right off of a fairly hot growing kind of diet, and we need to transition the rumens in those and the microbes in those rumens to kind of a more forage-friendly population before we just kick them out. And so fortunately that transition's usually a lot easier on the bulls than going the other way to a high starch diet, but not ignoring that aspect sort of helps support this isolation or quarantine. Simply putting some bulls on new bulls, get them social order sorted out amongst the yearling bulls, and even some dry hay can go a long ways to kind of transitioning those bulls.
Brad, the thing I'll just add there is just to kind of reiterate what Bob was saying about the diet, what you were saying about the vaccines is when you're thinking about these bulls, these are a longer run investment. This isn't a short run. In other words, you're not going to bring it in this year and get rid of it. So you might spend a little more time or maybe a little more additional resources because this is a longer run investment.
Great point, Dustin, because I think that is absolutely true. We're going to spend a little bit more time and a little bit more money on bringing them in. And one of the great questions that we got recently was from a listener, and they asked as a follow-up, and we talked about picking the right bull. We just discussed what to do when you're bringing them on the operation. I wanted to follow up on that a little bit more because we actually received a question that said, okay, I'm going to bring them on. They're going to be there for 30 days. I'm not sure what he's been on before, but he's been on some ration. What type of transition diet should I feed this bull before I turn him out into the breeding herd? And Weber, you had some thoughts in this area, and I think Larson probably does too.
Yeah, so it was a great question and follow-up, and we really appreciate those from our listeners. And so I did a little digging, kind of looking at what the nutrient requirements are of bulls as we get ready to turn them out to the breeding season. And I think there's really two groups of bulls we need to think about. One is, this fresh purchase bull that we got that we need to transition probably from some kind of high starch or higher starch diet into something that's primarily a forage-based diet, so their rumen's ready to turn out on native or tame grass pastures. And then the other group of bulls is mature bulls, because we want to make sure they're an appropriate body condition score for optimal breeding. And body condition scoring fact sheet our extension team here has put together a couple of years ago. And one of the really interesting bits in there is the relationship between body condition score and the percentage of bulls with satisfactory semen quality. And so bulls that are in kind of the optimal range is the upper 5s and 6s for body condition score at turnout. About 78% of those bulls have satisfactory semen quality. Bulls that are 7 body condition score, so a little fat, about 50%, just under 50% of those bulls had satisfactory semen quality. And likewise, bulls that were in the body condition score 4 range only had about 60% satisfactory semen quality. So body condition score in bulls is really important at turnout. And we typically don't think about bulls gaining weight during the breeding season. We expect them to be out covering cows. And so oftentimes they'll lose a body condition score or more during the breeding season. So if we haven't recovered that over the winter time before breeding turnout's a really good time to sort of spend a little resource to get those bulls in the adequate condition for breeding. So the good news is it doesn't take much nutrient density to get bulls to gain a little bit of weight as they get ready for breeding season. So as we transition, bulls that maybe were on a grow test were probably in the mid-3 target or maybe the low 4s for gain. Scale those back to a diet where they're expected to gain maybe 1.5 pounds or 2 to keep them kind of growing and in good shape going out to pasture. So a 1,200-pound bull that gains about 1.7 a day requires about 29 pounds of dry matter and only about 7% crude protein to make that gain happen. So not a very high protein requirement, but a little bit higher than kind of our typical native prairie hay that we might expose those bulls to in this kind of confinement or isolation period. So really, if we think about either dry distillers or 20% range cubes as the protein supplement to make that diet work, they only really need about 1 pound to 1.33 pounds of those two products to meet nutrient requirements. So it's really a modest supplementation to get them and get that rumen functioning properly in terms of adequate protein.
And I think, Bob, you've talked about, Larson has talked about the bull as that athlete. We're getting him ready for the season. We're in 2-a-days, right?
Yes.
We're in training camp.
Yep, that's exactly right. I had a professor that talked about bulls being breeding athletes as you turn them out into the pasture. And I think that you really want them in game shape. So I'm going to use my football analogy all the way through, but in good body condition, meaning they certainly could be too fat and they certainly could be too thin. And this is a place, a lot of times it is helpful to have some outside eyes, your veterinarian, nutritionist, to take a look at the bulls as well and to make sure that you've got them in the just right body condition going into the breeding season, because they're going to be walking a long distance and they need to have energy reserves but not be over-conditioned.
Comments there from K-State's Bob Larson, Bob Weaber, Dustin Pendell, and Brad White, along with Kansas Animal Health Commissioner Justin Smith. There is much more to this latest BCI Cattle Chat podcast. You can take it all in at beefcattleinstitute.org. Again, beefcattleinstitute, all one word, .org. This is Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and on we go now to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. The U.S. cattle industry is estimated to see losses of $13.6 billion due to the COVID-19 situation. That's according to a new analysis released by the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. Cow-calf producers, according to this analysis, are expected to see the biggest impact, with losses forecast at $3.7 billion. That amounts to $112 per head for each mature breeding animal. Stocker backgrounder losses are put at $157 per head for a total impact of $2.5 billion for 2020, while the feeding sector losses are figured at $206 per head or $3 billion. The NCBA CEO Colin Woodall says that this study, quoting here, also clearly illustrates the fact that while the relief funds provided by Congress were a good first step, there remains a massive need for more funding to be allocated as soon as members of Congress reconvene. And Smithfield Foods announced yesterday it will temporarily shutter 2 additional facilities later this week, one in Wisconsin and one in Missouri, due to the circumstances arising from the COVID-19 pandemic. The company said it would close its Martin City, Missouri plant indefinitely. That facility receives raw materials from Smithfield's Sioux Falls facility, which is also closed indefinitely. The company's dry sausage and bacon plant in Cudahy, Wisconsin, will be closed for 2 weeks as well. A small number of employees at both plants have tested positive for COVID-19. Employees will be paid for the next 2 weeks, during which time essential personnel will repeat the rigorous deep cleaning and sanitation that have been ongoing at the facilities, according to Smithfield. The closure of the Martin City plant, part of the domino effect underway in our industry, according to Smithfield's president and CEO, Kenneth Sullivan. He went on to say it highlights the interdependence and interconnectivity of our food supply chain. And indeed, the USDA's latest outlook for the meat sector is showing lower prices across the board. Here's more from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
World Ag Outlook Board Chair Mark Jekanowski points to anticipated production changes for the meat sector.
Our beef production forecast, we pulled back a bit, mainly based on lower steer and heifer slaughter. And given the very low prices for cattle recently, that also suggests that producers might be holding some cattle back for marketing.
He says USDA has increased its pork production numbers a little bit.
Broiler production, we pulled back quite a bit this month, and this is after several consecutive months of increasing our production estimates for broilers. But again, this time around, just given the real collapse in demand, especially at the restaurant and food service level.
Meanwhile, he says a decrease in demand is affecting prices.
It's showing up as a pretty large reduction compared to last month. And also, these prices are down quite a bit year over year if you look at 2020 compared to 2019. And that's the same for broilers, steers, and hogs.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Obviously, the coronavirus has put a big dent in the economy. However, leaders from the U.S. Soybean Export Council are highlighting that industry continues to export and look at market opportunities even through the pandemic. This week, that council is hosting a virtual conference with roughly 2,000 people watching its panel discussions on trade from as many as 100 countries. Throughout the conference, they've showcased that despite the global impacts of the COVID-19 virus, the U.S. soy industry is open for business. Those are the words of the council's CEO, Jim Sutter. He added that the Chekhov-funded trade group has adapted its work to connect with customers. According to last week's sales report from the USDA, overall soybean sales for the 1920 marketing year were at 32 million metric tons, about 4% higher than the same period last year. That takes us into this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update, and with that is Greg Akagi. Greg?
Charlene Patton, Consumer Media Specialist with the Kansas Soybean Commission, joins us. Charlene, the month of April is here, meaning we celebrate the month as National Soy Foods Month.
Absolutely. We're always excited excited to remind consumers of the benefits of soy and then also provide to them new resources and information that they can use to plan their diets and learn more about the soy foods that are available.
Charlene, what are some of those new resources that you can provide to consumers?
Anyone that contacts our office here during the month of April could receive 2 different publications. One is the Soy Foods Guide, which is 32 pages with really a broad amount of information from the health benefits of soy. It includes a listing of all the different soy foods and explains what they are. Plus, it's filled with recipes as well. It also will be sending out the Soy Connection, and that has just came out, the spring issue, and it is featuring fertility factors this year and how the soy foods makes an impact in that. And then we'll also provide our recipes that we're featuring for the month of April, and we have a lemon blueberry coffee cake, a whole wheat banana bread that's great, and then we're also featuring one of the recipes from the Soy Foods Guide.
And there are so many simple ways that you can incorporate soy into your diet.
We would really encourage consumers to do that in that you can add soy flour to your canister. We use a 7-to-1 ratio, 7 cups of all-purpose flour to 1 cup of soy flour, and you can use that in anything for your baking and add that soy protein. The soy beverages can also be used in your ingredients when you're replacing maybe some of the milk ingredients. There's also tofu. You can use that to reduce the calories when you're also adding it to dressings and some of the other recipes. So it's not always finding a whole new recipe. We provide a lot of guidelines where you can just incorporate them into the recipes you're already doing.
What's the best way for consumers to get these soy foods guides?
They can go online to kansassoybeans.org and request it, or they can call our 800 number, 877-KS-SOYBEAN, and ask for the April promotion for National Soy Foods Month.
Charlene, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's Charlene Patton, Consumer Media Specialist with the Kansas Soybean Commission, who joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Thanks, Greg. And one last invite here for you to take part in the final installment in that series of online gatherings on the economics of agriculture during the COVID-19 pandemic, being hosted by the Agricultural Economics Department at K-State. Tonight's session, the effects of all of this on land values with K-State's Michael Taylor. No fee, but registration is required. Look into that at agmanager.info. And this is Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so if you have a fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going in. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
This is Agriculture Today, and finishing up today's edition on horticultural matters, and more specifically, diseases in landscape pine trees around Kansas. Judy O'Mara is with us via phone. Judy is the director of the Plant Disease Diagnostic Laboratory here at Kansas State University. Judy, just give us a quick idea of the level of concern about these pine diseases in Kansas landscapes and otherwise. What are you seeing at the laboratory?
Eric, this is actually a very timely topic. There are 3 different problems that we see on pine trees in Kansas, and they all require a different response. So it's really important to identify which problem is active in the location.
Well, let's start with the most serious of the 3, pine wilt disease. This has been a notorious enemy of pines in recent years.
Pine wilt has been a devastating disease for Kansas, and it's across most of the state. Pine wilt is a disease that is caused by a nematode and vectored by an insect. And so the spread from tree to tree is with a beetle called the pine sawyer. Pine wilt causes a very quick and rapid death, and it starts showing up in landscapes in the fall. So usually like late August, September, October, November, if the tree starts to go off color, light green, light brown, and then dead within 2 to 3 weeks, that's usually pine wilt, and that tree should be removed. And that helps reduce potential spread of the disease.
But again, that happens so suddenly in the fall. So if a pine tree is showing some signs of yellowing now, it may not be pine wilt. So one needs to identify that before they make a rash decision.
Right. If you have a pine tree in your location and it appears to be part green, part brown. So if you're looking up into the tree and you see that 30% of the tree is brown, that's not pine wilt. Pine wilt, once it gets started in a tree, takes the tree out very quickly. Mm-hmm. If it's partially alive and partially affected, it's not pine wilt. So then that leads us back to what else it could be. There are two possible pine problems that it's important to correctly identify. A very common one is Diplodia tip blight. It's also known as pine tip blight. It's a fungal disease, and it occurs on mature pines in Kansas. So the average age where we start to see it show up is about 20, 25 years. Once it gets started, it chews away that tree for many, many, many years. The symptoms for Diplodia tip blight on pine are sort of like the name implies. It attacks the growth at the ends of the branches. So if you look very closely into these pine trees, what you'll notice is that the ends of the branches are dead. This fungal disease attacks the new expanding shoots. So it's April right now. And right now, almost any day now, the buds will start to elongate, the needles will start to emerge, and that is the infection period for Diplodia tip blight. So the fungus attacks the expanding shoots and kills them. So the symptoms that you might notice a little bit later are that the needles get about an inch long and then they die. That occurs every single year for the life of those pine trees.
Now, Diplodia can be treated as opposed to pine wilt disease, which really can't be treated after the ill effects set in, correct?
Correct. Diplodia, you're protecting the tree by treating it with a fungicide in the spring, starting about the third week of April, and then coming back about 2 weeks later and putting on a second fungicide treatment. The trick is that you have to do this year after year after year to protect that growth. So you're not applying anything curatively, you're putting it on protectively.
So that's Diplodia. There is this other blight called Dothostroma needle blight, which is, you say, become somewhat more prominent recently here. To stress, this does differ from Diplodia tip blight, you say, Judy.
It is very different. From a distance, it can look similar. It just appears as brown in the tree, but the difference is actually pretty striking. If you take a close look with Dothostroma, you'll see spotting on the needles. And then those spots will eventually grow all the way around the needle, and you'll get a partial needle scorch. So that basically means the outer half of the needle is brown, base of the needle is green. What will happen with Dothostroma is it is more serious in plantings, not necessarily of a particular age, but in plantings that are very crowded and have poor air circulation. And that does tend to be mature plantings. So a privacy screen or a windbreak, they have a very crowded planting. What you will see is that the disease starts in the bottom of the tree in the interior needles. So the new growth looks good, but those interior needles will have spotting and scorching, and then eventually the impact of Dothostroma needle blight is that it will knock those needles off. So if you have a multi-year infection, 2 to 3 years, what you'll notice is that the bottom of the tree holds no needles because the disease has just knocked them off. So that's actually one way you can separate it out from Diplodia tip blight. Mm-hmm. Diplodia tip blight kills the new shoot growth and the ends of the branches die, and that will usually be on one side of the tree. With Dothostroma, it's like in the bottom third of the tree in the interior.
And Dothostroma requires a bit different approach in as far as control, although that's conducted, like with Diplodia, in the springtime, you tell us.
Dothostroma also requires a fungicide treatment, but the timing is different. With Dothostroma, the best level of protection is going to be mid-May, mid-June. And so you'll put on 2 applications about a month apart.
We won't go through the list of fungicidal options there, Judy, but folks can refer to a host of information from K-State Research and Extension, not only on the nature of these pine diseases, but how to respond to them.
K-State Horticulture has a great web page called Common Plant Problems in Kansas. So if you're looking for more specific information on the 3 pine diseases that we discussed, you're going to have individual fact sheets there, and they will show great photographs, they'll have good descriptions, and they'll have a list of the management products that should be used and the timing that they need to be used for. So I would spend some time going back and looking at that material on the K-State Horticulture website. If they're not sure what they have, they can reach out to their local county extension agent, who is going to be very familiar with the common pine problems that we see in Kansas.
And if need be, samples can be sent to the Plant Disease Diagnostic Laboratory that you oversee here at K-State for identification. And Judy, thanks for bringing these to our attention, as common as they are, we understand, in Kansas pine trees. Much obliged for your time right here.
Thank you, Eric.
She's the director of the Plant Disease Diagnostic Laboratory at Kansas State University. That's Judy O'Mara, passing along that information on this week's K-State Horticulture segment. That is our time for today. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson, bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.